Okay, and we're live. Awesome. Yay! Hi, Nicci. Thanks for joining.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes. Awesome. So just while people are joining, so super quick. So for everybody that is just joining, so I am Corey from Dogly, and I am really excited and thankful that Nicci from NorthPoint Pets has joined us tonight. And so I have a bunch of questions on DCM that we made this whole list. We have like 20 questions that we're going to go through. But before we get into that, I thought, Nicci, do you want to just like quickly give a super quick intro background on you and kind of like what we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, sure. So I actually got my start in human medicine and human nutrition. I worked for a couple of pharmaceutical companies for a few years, and I eventually made my way over to pet health because, like many of us in the industry, we kind of found alternative ways because our own pets were sick. So I kind of had a similar situation and figured that there must be a better way to go about certain things. And I ended up going back to school, and I did undergrad and graduate work in nutrition and chemistry and biology, and got really, really lucky and fortunate to work and learn alongside some of the most I would say aggressive and envelope pushing researchers around the world. I spent some time in Helsinki, I spent some time in the UK. So I like to hope I bring a unique perspective to things and help others kind of do the same and help them figure out the best for their pets and their individual situation.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's your background is super interesting, and your point of view is obviously really helpful for people, especially when we're talking about something like DCM, where I think everybody that's joining has probably seen the headlines circulating over the past, I guess it's been months now.
Right. Well, it's been a little over a year that we've seen this for sure.
Wow, it feels like a lot has been said and happened in a short period of time, but especially like I guess what the updated FDA report came out in the last week, and it just seems like a lot of people are having questions and worried, rightfully so, especially if their dogs have been diagnosed with DCM, and so yeah, would love to get your perspective on everything that's kind of been happening with DCM.
Right, for sure. I think before we really dive in, I want to make it a point, and I know you did too, and a lot of us want to make a point that if your dog has been diagnosed with DCM, or maybe they have some significantly high risk factors for that, or maybe they're in some of these breed groups, we want to make sure that our advice or some of the things that we're talking about do not replace the advice and the treatment and care of a qualified veterinarian. A lot of what we're going to talk about really is part of that integrative care approach, and it's not meant to replace anything.
Yep, for sure. Awesome. Great way to start. Amazing. So for everybody that's watching, so we asked for your questions over the past like 24 hours or so, and we made this really long Google Doc with about like 20 questions. And I wrote them all down. So while we go through this, I am just going to literally go through all the questions that we got and that you've been hearing. And I will Vanna White style put them up on the board, and we'll just go through them. And if anybody else has questions or comments as we go through, I will be watching the comment box as well. So definitely send us anything there. So the first question, the big opener, what is DCM?
So dilated cardiomyopathy, or how I will probably refer to it for the rest of this, is DCM. And originally, about a year ago, this was kind of unfairly termed diet-mediated, taurine-deficient dilated cardiomyopathy, because that's what we kind of thought was going on, is that foods were deficient in taurine or meat, however you want to describe it. And it was causing what they thought was causing a really severe heart condition in dogs that were up until this point, or up until it was really noticed, was kind of restricted to certain breeds. So we know golden retrievers, certain hounds, and other types of breeds were kind of predisposed or genetically predisposed to this. And what it is if you think about the heart, it has several chambers. And as it becomes inefficient, the heart muscle will actually work harder. And for any other muscle in the body, this is a good thing, because then the heart muscle gets stronger and it gets bigger. But within the heart, there are valves that separate these chambers. And unfortunately, what happens is the heart starts to get bigger, and those valves don't work correctly. So now blood flow isn't flowing the way that it should. And then therefore the lungs also don't get the oxygen that they need. And over time, it's kind of leads to congestive heart failure in a lot of cases. And that's something that you may be familiar with. We hear about it in people a lot, where fluid actually backs up into the lungs. And it's essentially a way of almost drowning. So it can be a really, really scary and a really, really painful and a really uncomfortable disease for either dogs or for people. And that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. And I think, a lot of people don't quite understand what that means, but that's exactly what it is in a nutshell. Kind of explaining it in layman's terms.
Yeah. Just quickly, is the video lagging for anybody else? Your sound is totally fine for me. It might be my Wi-Fi that your video is a little bit behind. Can anybody just comment and just give us like a thumbs up if it's all good for you guys? I also see we have a couple questions in here, which I will get to. Some of them are sort of similar to the questions that we have. So I'll kind of bring them in as we go through.
Yeah, we can circle back at the end too if there's a lot that maybe we don't have in our
Stacy says lagging video for me too. Is it better? It actually caught up for me now. Is it? Yes, lagging for me too. Oh no. Is it both of us, or is it just Nicci, or just Nicci? How is it am I okay for you?
You're fine. It looks like I'm lagging, but all the audio's fine.
Yeah, but now it looks like it's actually caught up. Can everybody that says that it's lagging, is it better now? Doing a little poll of the room. As long as the sound works, I'm fine. Okay, you're fine. All right, let's just keep pushing.
All right, sounds good.
I'll just, whatever. Okay, so the next question that we had, these headlines are scary. I'm not sure what to believe.
So I think that they're scary for us too. I first read the FDA report and I thought to myself, oh, okay. I actually thought the FDA report was quite great. I think very, very few people have read it. The headlines, however, when those started coming out and, people started, I got, I don't know, probably 60 text messages, Facebook messages, emails, phone calls, you name it, from friends, clients, what have you. And I kind of had to step back for a second and say, are we talking about two different things? And, as I started to read some of these news articles, I said, wow, a lot of this is really taken out of context. Is it scary? Absolutely. Is it something that I'm trying to diminish? Absolutely not. And I think, that's a really important point to make. But I think that a lot of these headlines are unfair. And I think, Corey, we kind of talked about this earlier. A lot of journalists, politics is a great example. You read a news article and you're going to get one side or the other. You're very rarely going to get a realistic, full handle on what's going on. And I think, a lot of those news articles, again, they were like, these X amount of brands are causing an issue and your dog's going to get heart disease and you're going to die, or your dog's going to die. And I don't think that that's a fair and accurate summary of the FDA report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what we talked a little bit about it before, that like when it first came out, what we said to people was like, all right, let's like take a deep breath. Like it's okay. Like we'll figure this out together. We're with you. We'll like get to the bottom of it.
Right.
We don't need to like I could see, a lot of people and even myself, like you just get worried when you see these like headlines come through and shared all over the place, and everybody having opinions and giving
Right.
and feedback and whatever. Like, I can totally understand, especially for people, if you know somebody whose dog has been diagnosed, or if you're going through it yourself, like I totally get it.
Right.
But I think it's important to breathe and like.
Absolutely. And I would, if you're really worried, or you kind of caught wind of this from a news article and not the actual Food and Drug Administration website, I would really caution you to read what you said with a grain of salt, and I would go to that report. I think it's very easy to read. I think that they did a good job. Really, in a nutshell, what they're saying is these brands have a correlation and not a causation, and very, very different words in the scientific world. Anything can really have a causation to another thing. Example that I used earlier is we could put some of the same charts together and say, oh, well, all these dogs that were diagnosed with DCM lived in single family households in the suburbs. Okay, well, is that likely to be a causatory factor for DCM? Probably not. So it's important to kind of put that into perspective. They said, listen, this is a common denominator that we're seeing. Over the past year, we looked into and tried to figure out if there is a true link. And, I'm not saying that there is or there isn't, but the truth is that they can't figure it out yet. And they've come out and said last year, I haven't heard them update it, but I know last year they said it's going to take us 5 years to figure it out. Originally, they thought it was taurine deficiency. And as they started whole blood taurine and plasma taurine testing these dogs, they found out that some of them were very deficient, but most of them were not taurine deficient. So that kind of sent everybody back to the drawing board.
Yeah, which is super frustrating.
It's super frustrating. I mean, we want answers just as much, if not more, than most pet owners. So it's something that's really, really frustrating for sure.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is this an epidemic?
So I recently wrote a white paper on this exact issue because, again, a lot of my clients kind of were coming in feeling like dogs and cats are kind of falling from the sky, and that this is a major, major issue. I have 3,500 active clients. I have not had one case of DCM. I usually get a few new cases, unfortunately, of pets being diagnosed with cancer every day. Some of the stats that we have that you can go and pull from PubMed or Google Scholar or whatever platform you want to use, half of American dogs are overweight. Diabetes rates are rising faster than we can measure. Cancer is becoming more prevalent, not in the old, but also in the young. Kidney disease, liver disease, dogs and cats experiencing more and more food and environmental sensitivities. We have, DCM, it's affected pretty small number of cats and dogs. Again, not diminishing those. This is something that we have to learn and look into. But out of approximately over 500 dogs, just over 500 dogs, out of 77 million thus far, that number can go up. It probably will go up a bit. It's about 0.00000, so 5 zeros, 7%. Not by any means an epidemic.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's just like one more thing for us to worry about.
We have heartworm, we have flea and tick, diseases. We have all of those other things I just mentioned, and now it's like one more thing. Yeah, for sure.
And I think it feels like it is cancer. Cancer, whether it's cancer, obesity, all of those numbers are scary in terms of like how many dogs are affected by those, and those are just like two things that our dogs are commonly affected by. But it feels like DCM is now taking, it's what everybody's focused on, and it's taking everybody's attention. So it feels like it's almost affecting more or a bigger conversation than things that have been around and we've been worrying about for a while now. I guess it adds to the list of things that we need to be aware of.
Right, for sure. And I think, just because your dog maybe has some sort of heart condition, right? So like a valve regurgitation or a murmur or, any of those types of things, it doesn't mean that your dog has or will get DCM. There's plenty of other cardiac issues that, can be attributed to other things, and it's not necessarily related to food. It's not, I guess it's not as big of a worry, I guess, as some of the other more common cardiac issues, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yep. Okay, next question. How many dogs, and should I be worried? So how many dogs were, I guess we kind of just touched on this, how many dogs were talked about in the study, and should I be worried? I mean, I guess it's like sort of a yes and no answer.
Right. Well, so I guess, the should I be worried? And the answer is, it depends.
Right.
It depends. Are you feeding one of those foods that's on the list? I don't think we should be condemning the foods that are on the list, because again, if you actually break down and look at the actual numbers, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm gonna just try and remember from memory here, but I think Akana was like mid-60s, right? Signature was after that. Taste the Wild was after that. So, when you start to kind of look at the amount of cases we have in comparison to the amount of dogs and the amount of dogs actually eating those extremely popular foods, I was actually surprised that the numbers weren't a little bit higher. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's something to like rush out and run to the store. I think you have enough time to sit and make an educated decision and figure out what is best for your individual pet.
Mm-hmm. Oops, did we just freeze? Oh, I think we're good. Okay. Okay, the next question we had is, how do I know I'm picking a food that is safe?
So this is totally a loaded question, because again, the answer is that it depends. Right. It depends on your individual animal. And I think a lot of times we as pet owners, and myself, I have been guilty of this over the years, is, you want your pet to eat a certain thing because you've read or certain things, or, that X food is super healthy. But the reality is every dog or cat or person for that matter does not do well on every food, right? There's no one food that's right for every animal. So if your pet is visibly healthy and they're checking out great at the veterinarian, and there's no signs of disease or illness and symptoms going on, I think that it's okay to kind of watch and observe. But then it's also, again, knowing your pet. If things aren't going well, then maybe it's a good idea to switch foods and try and maybe figure out or look at some patterns within that food, and you can now find a food that has different ingredients or different proteins or what have you.
Yeah. And can I just dig into that a little bit? So what does that mean if it's not going well, or if it is going well?
I think, again, we kind of have, as a society, we've kind of come to think of certain things that dogs experience or have as normal, right? So bad breath, it's the smelly dog smell, excess shedding, them having a dull coat, that Frito feet type of thing that a lot of dogs have going on. I think, those are not normal things. I have 5 dogs. My house does not smell like dog. We'll have some hair floating around because we have a lab and a German Shepherd. Right. But aside from that, there's not excess shedding. So if you're seeing things like that, or you're seeing maybe their eyes not be so bright, or there's really bad breath, I think that that's probably a clue that things probably aren't going as well as they could. Other signs are, really smelly urine. I've seen that sometimes with some really processed food, excess going to the bathroom. So, going to the bathroom more than, I would say, 2 times a day if they're on a dry food. On a raw food, they really should only be going once, maybe twice every once in a while. If they're going a lot, or if things are really smelly and really like rancid, gross, I would say that that's probably, again, a clue that things are probably not going as well as they should.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Great. Thanks. That was a detour from our list of questions. Okay. Next question that we had is there a benefit to grain-free food?
So again, the answer is it depends, right? I think, grains have been vilified over the years, and rightfully so, because they've been so adulterated that they're not what they were when they initially started out, right? So, GMOs are a hot topic. Roundup is a hot topic. All the other pesticides and chemicals and fertilizers that we're using in modern agriculture are becoming a major issue. And, there's still plenty of people out there that want to debate that, plenty of researchers that want to debate that. But I think at this point, again, go on PubMed, go on Google Scholar, you can find enough peer-reviewed, well-written, well-researched information to show that consuming grains, or any produce for that matter, that has a lot of those chemicals is bad. So I think that's, in the early to mid 90s is when we saw a lot of that pesticide and herbicide usage go up in modern agriculture. And then about 5 to 10 years later is when we started to see all of these problems with dogs being allergic to certain grains, or what we kind of assumed that dogs were allergic to certain grains. And then all this grain-free stuff came out, and we moved over to feeding dogs grain-free and recommending limited ingredient diets, and things kind of seemed to go away. And I think the big miss is that people don't realize it wasn't necessarily the grains that caused the issue. It was the chemicals, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're going to feed your pet a grain in food and they're using organic grains, or they're using grains that are at least meant for human consumption and not feed grade, I think there's some value there, because typically, a lot of people don't realize this, the grain-driven foods are going to be far less starchy, or for a better way of saying it, have less sugar than a lot of those grain-free foods or limited ingredient foods. If you replace the grains with something, it still has to be starchy or sticky enough to hold that kibble together. If you remove the starch or the carbohydrates, you would just have basically a bag of like meat dust, which is pretty gross. So, and it would also be very expensive, right? So that's, the carbohydrates, whether they're grains or not, they hold some value in terms of making kibble affordable, having it be affordable for us to feed our pets. But are grains bad? I guess the short answer is no. I don't necessarily have a problem. It's really sourcing that it boils down to.
And so what do you think about people, again, going off of the board, what do you think about people like now switching, if they were on grain-free and now switching to a grain food? Like, does that...
So I guess it really depends on the reasoning behind doing that, right? Is your dog have DCM? Are they in one of those risk factor groups? Mm-hmm. I would rather see, and I know we've talked about this in the past, I would rather see people add more fresh food. I think there's a lot more value there. And I think that, again, while we don't have as much evidence as we would like, or research as we would like, it's coming. And, I've met with a lot of the researchers and have seen a lot of what they're working on, and it's coming, and it's all going to come really fast, and it's going to hit the industry really hard. And I think it's going to be a great thing for all of us, and it's going to be a great thing for our pets, and it's going to change a lot of the dialogue that we see with our veterinarians and other professionals in the industry. But, I think switching just kind of blindly from a grain-free to a grain-driven, I think that can be dangerous, right? But again, if you're picking something that has high-quality grains, probably a good idea to avoid a lot of the corn, wheat, and soy foods under most circumstances. If you can pick something with some of the ancient grains, I don't really have an issue with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Let's see, we kind of talked about that. Okay, the next question is, talking about the FDA report, is it the absence of grain or the presence of legumes that, wait, what does this say? Is it the absence of grain or the presence of legumes?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I know what she's asking.
Avoid. I can't read my own handwriting. So there.
So one of the theories that the FDA and a lot of the researchers are looking into is, and we know this in humans, there are documented cases of this in humans, when you have too many of certain plant-based proteins in the diet, it can block or prevent the body from utilizing other nutrients, specifically taurine, which kind of makes sense when you think about a lot of these dogs coming back with fine taurine levels, within normal limit taurine levels, and they still have DCM. So that's potentially one of the factors. I don't think grains are necessary in the diet. And again, that comes from an evidence-based approach, that comes from research that's out there. Dogs don't make enough amylase. And amylase is one of the enzymes that breaks down a lot of the different starches that we commonly feed them. The other thing is that the dog's digestive system is a lot shorter than humans and a lot of other mammals that are out there that are consuming these types of ingredients, and they don't digest them as well. I'm not saying that they can't, but they don't digest them as well. And I think over time, what you end up seeing when they're given in too high of quantities, it will end up with a lot of different issues.
I hear somebody squeaking. So I'm going to kind of skip to, I know there was another one, a question similar to this, kind of talking about ingredient reading. And should people be reading ingredients, and should they be looking for taurine? Like, is there something that they should be looking for or does it not matter?
So I think what becomes confusing when starting to look at ingredient labels is a lot of companies now, in order to make us feel like we're giving them more meat, they've started fractionating some of the suspect ingredients. And they've done this kind of before DCM kind of came to light. And if you add together, I think it's not so much looking at the types of ingredients. Again, there's all things that we know we don't want to see on a label, right? You don't want to see byproduct, you don't want to see corn, you don't want to see wheat, you don't want to see soy. But if you start to look at the starches, right? So peas, legumes, potatoes, all their different types of protein or starch, and you add those all together, a lot of times those end up becoming a bigger ingredient when you add them together than the meat which came before that. A lot of people don't realize that when you're reading an ingredient label for a dry food, all of those ingredients are listed in the order that they were added pre-cooked weight. So for example, if you see, whole chicken, that was added, the whole chicken with the moisture. Chicken, is going to be about 70% moisture for the sake of argument. And you remove 90% of that, what happens to that second ingredient on the list? If they're using, dried potatoes or lentils or peas or wheat or corn or soy for that matter, those ingredients now become the first. So there's a lot of deception out there when it comes to reading ingredient labels. I think another one that a lot of people don't talk about, and this is true for quite a few of the brands that are on that list for the FDA, is there's something called the salt divider. I know Karen Becker and Rodney Habib did one of these not that long ago where they explained the salt divider, and that actually caught a lot of people's attention, and I was happy about, because this is something I feel like I talk about all the time, and nobody really it never really gains traction. Yeah. Salt can be no more than 1% of any pet food, right? So when you have brands that tout their fruit and their vegetable content and their vitamins or probiotics or whatever it may be, if you actually look at the label for a lot of these foods, you see those things after salt. Salt doesn't have to be in a pet food, but it is in a lot of them. So if we know that salt can be no more than 1% per AFCO, and then after salt, you see all the fruit, the veggies, all the good stuff that they're promoting, chances are that's a deceptive marketing tactic. But most people never read that far in the ingredient list.
Yeah, that's what we talked about that. I guess I don't even know when it was, but it was the same idea where it's like, if there's like a beautiful picture of salmon on the front of the bag, and the salmon is after the salt, like,
right.
Salmon is
fish is always a great one because, fish is really expensive. Good fish is really expensive.
Yeah.
So a lot of companies add a lot of fish whole, which sounds great for marketing. But again, that usually ends up being a very small amount of the food at the end of the day.
Yeah. We just got one question on this. If it's not necessary, why are they adding salt?
Well, I guess that's like the question of the year or decade, I guess, because there's so many things that they add to pet food that they don't have to. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. We had another question about when we were talking about adding fresh into food. Mentioned adding more fresh food. If you were to add fresh grains yourself, what and how?
So if you're adding fresh grains to kibble, you're really just adding to the carbohydrate value, right? So you have 3 macronutrients in any food or any diet. You have your carbohydrates, you have your protein, and your fat. If you have an average house pet, you should have protein at the top, fat in the middle, carbohydrates at the bottom. Working dogs sometimes, or if your pet has certain diseases, I work with a lot of working dogs and police dogs, sometimes we'll add fat in at the top in certain situations. So basically, if you're going to add carbohydrates to a dry kibble, it's not something I would really recommend. If you want to add vegetables, however, leafy greens, blueberries, watermelon, those types of things have a lot of antioxidants and can help to combat some of the negative effects of processed protein and processed starch. I think have more value when it comes to adding them to kibble. If you're feeding a super high starch kibble and you're adding grains to it, I would rather see you switch the food, I think, at that point.
Awesome. All right, back to the list of questions. Let's see, did we touch on this? What is taurine? Did we kind of answer that before? Do you want to dig into that a little bit more?
No, yeah. So taurine is a sulfur amino acid. And it's not, this is where things get really confusing. And I think I saw on the list that somebody asked, is this the same for cats? So I'm kind of going to tackle this all together. Taurine is made from cysteine and methionine. Cysteine and methionine are found in a lot of grains. So that's probably one of the reasons why, another one of the reasons why we're seeing not as much of this issue in grain-driven products. Dogs can make their own cysteine, or they can make their own taurine, I'm sorry, from cysteine and methionine. Cats, however, cannot. Cats are what we call obligate carnivores. So they are meant to eat meat. They have to eat meat. They need to obtain the majority of their, or they need to obtain the essential amino acids from meat. So if you start to add things like grains to their food, we can end up with some other nutritional deficiencies and some GI issues and kidney issues and liver issues and other types of things that we kind of don't want to see. And that's really the distinction. Back in the 80s, some of you may remember, we had an issue with DCM in cats. And it was because pet food companies were using a lot more carbohydrates and plant-based proteins and not enough meat by any stretch in their cat food. And cats were coming up taurine deficient and ending up with dilated cardiomyopathy. A lot more cats were sick. A lot more cats died. So the solution was to add taurine, a synthetic taurine, and then add more meat. And since then, we really haven't had a problem. I mean, I think there's a handful of cases every single year out of the, who even knows how many cats we have at this point because of, stray populations and things like that. So taurine, again, this is because taurine is not essential for dogs. That's why sometimes they're able to get away with, I don't want to say thrive, but get away with vegetarian or vegan diets because they can assimilate those nutrients from other things.
Okay. So the next question is related, and I see we have a couple questions. I will get to you guys, I promise. Let me just stay on this taurine thing for 1 second. So the next question is, what should I look for in a taurine supplement? And I guess and sort of added to that, is it necessary to add a taurine supplement?
So it's not a bad idea. Again, if it's being blocked from some of these plant-based proteins or lectins, then I think some of the people that I've worked with have said, well, kind of what's the point? So if you're going to add it to a grain-free or high starch diet, maybe there's, again, better things you can do. Taurine can be really expensive. There's a shortage right now because everybody's going out and buying it. Taurine, I would say, in terms of sourcing that supplement, I would really be more comfortable and kind of deferring that question to the veterinarians because I believe that they have a better source. I really would avoid buying that type of stuff from third-party retailers, like your Amazons and things like that, because we see a lot of counterfeit things, and because there's a shortage, there's a lot of people that will take advantage of that. really the only place to get taurine, Japan, China. So that becomes scary. It's not an environmentally friendly process at all. The only way to get it really is from the blood. So they have to bloodlet animals in order to get it, unless it's made synthetically. The problem is again, we don't know a lot about synthetic taurine and what the long-term effects are, and if it's as safe or as effective as the natural thing. So I think a better answer, and this is what I personally do, is I add foods that are naturally rich in taurine. Taurine only comes from meat, as we discussed, right? It doesn't come from grains. So I think that if you're adding in different types of heart from whatever animal, beef heart, chicken heart, pork heart are all things that duck hearts are usually things that we can get our hands on pretty easily. If you have a good relationship with a butcher. Muscle meat, for the most part, has a pretty significant amount of taurine. There are certain types of proteins that maybe don't have as much: venison, lamb. Again, it's going to depend what part of the world you're in. Other sources of taurine include canned, wild-caught sardines and water. So usually I recommend from the Nordic area. Try not to get any fish off the coast of South America. Goat's milk can also be another source. It's not as high as some other things, but goat's milk, chicken breast, and foods that are just rich or high in taurine. And there's tons of lists that you can probably go out and find. I think I may have one on my Facebook page that I put out a while back. Or of course, reach out to Corey and I. We can get you some more accurate information, or what's the word I'm looking for? More reliable information.
So just to recap. So for people who, so if you're worried about this, and you want, you're feeding, let's say you're feeding grain-free and you're nervous about the brand that you're feeding, and you thought oh, I'll just go buy a taurine supplement and it'll fix everything.
Probably not.
Right. So don't do that. And if people are wanting to add more taurine, I guess first step is talk to your vet and see if that's actually something that your dog needs. And second step, if it is, then look to the many different real whole foods that they could be adding to the food.
Right. And I think, to that point, if you're going to seek out a certain nutrient for yourself or for your pet, or, whatever it may be, there's value in the whole plant. And if anybody saw my Facebook Live on CBD a week or so ago, we talked about whole plant. And this is going to go for anything, right? Taurine that's coming from meat, or a nutrient that's coming from plants, or whatever it may be. There's value in the whole plant. Every little piece or every type of nutrient, trace mineral, vitamin, what have you, in there has a role in the absorption, in the utilization, and the entire chain of how things work, or the entire chain of biochemistry and how that works in the body. Mm-hmm. So isolating supplements and isolating nutrients is kind of an older practice. It's not something that we do in functional nutrition very often, I should say. In certain situations and certain disease states or types or deficiencies, we may, but in general, we try and provide the nutrients in their most natural form whenever we can.
Mm-hmm. Oops. Is my video lagging for you now?
You lagged a little bit for me.
Yeah, I think I'm lagging a little bit. Maybe, I don't know. Am I, everybody, we're gonna pull the room again. Am I lagging for everybody? I probably am. But you can still hear me, okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. Then whatever. Who cares about the video? All right. The next question, which I see, actually, you know what? I'm going to take a question from the comments. Mm-hmm. So we have one question that says, are there better grains than others? For example, oats or barley?
So I think that's a great question. I always recommend avoiding the corn, wheat, and soy. Not necessarily because those ingredients themselves are bad. I mean, we can probably do 3 Facebook Lives picking apart each of those. But I think there's more valuable grains for dogs and for people. Oats, barley, spelt is a good one. Any of those types of things, buckwheat, are all, when they're cooked or they're processed correctly, can provide a little bit more value for sure.
Okay. I'm just gonna, I see that we had actually, maybe I froze because we got a bunch of comments in at the same time. let's see. The question on the 16 food list, I'm going to come back to in 1 minute. Let's see. Jane, other co-founder of Dogly, says, I think people are still confused that their dogs need grains because of the grain-free headlines. Can we clarify?
So I think it's really important to, like kind of how we talked about in the beginning, the headlines are really scary and they're not accurate. I think it's important to consult the FDA report itself. I think that they did a really good job at giving information. They state right in the report, like I said, there's not a direct causational link. They have a correlation, but nothing else thus far. Do dogs need grains? No. If you're feeding a grain-free food and you don't necessarily have a specific reason why, your dog's not sensitive, things like that, you can probably find a higher quality grain in food, or a high quality, I don't want to say higher, but just a high quality grain in food. And then of course, the better answer is to add some fresh food. So if you want to counteract the carbohydrates, whether you have grain free or grain driven, add some fresh food. I think that's probably the most sound advice. And that's the advice that most of the veterinarians that I work with pretty regularly are recommending.
Awesome. One more question in the comments, just back on taurine. If the hearts are dehydrated, is the taurine still intact? And then she just added, or freeze dried. So if hearts are dehydrated or freeze dried, is the taurine still intact?
So I've seen answers on all ends of the spectrum on this. The taurine is still intact. Obviously, again, if you can find fresh sources, that's always be the real thing. If not, then dehydrated or freeze dried is going to be second best.
Okay, awesome. All right, now to the question that I think we had a lot of people asking us, and I know I saw a couple of people in the comments. This list of 16 brands that came out.
Yeah.
So I saw a list of specific brands to avoid. Is this a reputable list?
So again, if you look at the FDA report does not say that these brands are by and large a huge problem. Again, if you actually break it down and look at the numbers of those brands, again, Corey, maybe you have it in front of you. Akana, mid-60s,
something like that.
Signature, Taste of the Wild. None of them have more than 100 cases out of the tons of thousands of dogs that eat those particular foods. Do I think that there's still a risk? Probably. But is it as big as some of the news articles themselves make it seem to be? Probably not. Again, if you're doing things like adding fresh food or mixing different things in, using canned food, in addition to that, I think you're probably a lot safer and a lot better off. I don't carry a lot of those brands or recommend a lot of the brands that are on that list. And I haven't for a long time. And it's really not necessarily because of this DCM issue. It's because of other issues entirely, right? If you do the math for some of these brands, they have a lot more carbohydrates than they let out to lead. They fractionate their ingredients. They have salt on their label. They maybe don't have sound nutritional backing. They don't have somebody that is qualified to make recipes for these types of foods. So I think all of those, in my opinion, are better reasons not to feed that food, not necessarily because they have a relationship to DCM.
Right. It's just like one of the things that they're now tied to.
Right, for sure.
And I was just going to mention something else, and now I totally lost it. But that's okay. So another question, similar question that we get, and I'm sure you get a lot as well, is fill in the blank brand good? And it's tied to obviously tied to the list of 16. But like, when the list came out, it was like, is this brand good? Is that brand good? And like, how do we come into recommending food? I think it's really hard, and I really try and avoid recommending things blanket, because not every food is right for every dog or every cat or that matter, right? So it's really important to put things into context for your individual pet.
does your pet do well on a high meat protein diet? Do they do well on a high fat diet? Do they do well on a moderate or high carb diet? I think all of those things are really important when trying to pick one. There are tons of brands that are not listed on that list that, I have a better or have more confidence in, and that are really careful with their sourcing, and they're super transparent when it comes to testing and who they're working with, who their nutritionist is. So I think, choosing a brand that you can have a better relationship with, or maybe even call and somebody picks up the phone, I think that those are brands that you probably want to start looking into. I know that a lot of the brands on that list, it's really hard to get a hold of somebody and not get a scripted answer. So, again, it's not a secret. I am a fresh and raw food feeder through and through. And I think, another thing that we talked about was up until really a year and a half ago, I was always taught through all of my education, all of my internships, all of the veterinarians that I worked with, you're never supposed to mix raw and kibble, right? So you kind of have these two camps, and you have people that feed kibble and you have people that feed raw, and you have people that believe that you can kind of only go one way or the other. When we were in Helsinki last year, all of this research that I hope is going to be published by the end of the year shows how much of a benefit there is in mixing the two. We thought that, and it was all theory, there was nothing rooted in science here, that mixing the two prior to this would actually cause digestive upset long term. It would cause dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of the gut bacteria. It would actually allow for the growth of pathogens. So the things we hear about that are scary, the salmonella and the listeria and the E. coli and the campylobacter, all those types of things. So what they actually found out, and there's another case study online, it's not peer reviewed, but it's actually a very good case study, where they fed both kibble and raw to dogs, and they found that the raw actually digested at the same rate, maybe even a little bit quicker, because the body basically just kind of picked the nutrients that it needed, and everything else kind of went out, or the body utilized a lot more efficiently. In Helsinki, what they found was they started with increments of 10%. So they took away 10% of kibble and they added in 10% fresh food, and they drew some biomarkers, and then they added in 20% fresh food, and then they did 30%, and so on and so forth till they got to 100. When they extrapolated all this data and they put it in the computer and the computer spit it out, what they found was that at 20% fresh food, whether that's cooked, whether that's raw, they did it on raw, but there are some studies that are starting to be duplicated on cooked, is the inflammatory biomarkers for all these diseases that we're talking about, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, were dramatically decreased at 20%. So what that tells us is that by feeding 20% fresh food, which is affordable for most people, you can still get the benefits of raw and the affordability of kibble. The more raw you feed, the better. The more fresh food you feed, the better, because you're going to have lower markers. But there was a really dramatic decrease at 20% that stayed pretty relatively even until they got to 100.
Wow. And so is that, I mean, I guess in general, but like for especially for people who, maybe they're feeding one of the brands that are on the like list of 16 or whatever, and now they're nervous. Like, aside from taking a deep breath and not freaking out at first, and looking at the dog in front of them, and kind of thinking back to what we were talking about in the beginning about like what a dog who is eating a food that is like working for them, what that looks like and what it doesn't look like, assuming like their dog, looks good, they know their dog the best. Is that what you would recommend to somebody who is feeding one of the brands?
Especially if they don't want to change. I mean, I know that there's a lot of people that don't want to change because of allergies or GI sensitivities. So if, they just want to kind of put a little extra step of precaution, I think that that's a great set of advice. Is that something that everybody's going to recommend or agree with? No. And I think to that point is there's different approaches to this, right? There's many different ways to go about mitigating risk, and it's okay to kind of figure out which one of those pieces of advice works best for your dog. I mean, depending on who your veterinarian is, they may recommend one of the 5 that's on the WSAVA guidelines because that's what they know and that's what they're comfortable with. If you're working with an integrative or a holistic veterinarian, they may tell you that it's okay to home cook for your dog, or that it's okay to mix the kibble and the raw, or maybe that, you know, they feel that raw seems to be the best course, or, you know, any of the others. I think, you know, to those points, if you look at the FDA put out a lot of really cool graphs, I think. And one of the graphs was dry food in comparison to wet, home cooked, and raw, I believe, right? Semi-moist and canned. And largely, again, I to my point, this is a processed food problem, not necessarily a grain-free or grain-in problem. It's the fact that we're processing our food beyond a recognizable state, and then we're kind of surprised that our pets are coming down with all of these issues, right? If you can provide them with more fresh food, I think that that's probably, again, the best option.
Great. To get back to the list, and I see we have a couple questions that are similar to what I'm actually just going to say. So we had another question come in that said, should we avoid foods with chickpeas, potatoes, peas, and lentils? And I know this is sort of tied with the ingredient question that we had before, but we also had a question. Somebody said that I like to feed my pup sweet potatoes from time to time along with his kibble. This DCM issue makes me feel like I shouldn't be doing this.
Right. I would avoid foods that have an excess in them. You know, if you see peas down, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on the ingredient list, you know, in or between that spot, I think it's likely that it's okay. If you turn over the back of the bag and you see peas, potatoes, chickpeas, pea hulls, pea starch, I would say it's probably not a good idea to go with that food. Its overall starch content obviously plays a huge role here, and that's, again, where some of those deceptive marketing techniques make it a little bit difficult. But if you read that ingredient list and see, you know, far less of those ingredients, or maybe none of them, I think that's okay. You're going to find grain foods that have those ingredients. You're going to find grain-free foods that don't. It just takes a little bit of time to kind of figure out what is best and what foods fit into what you think your pet does well with. And I think, you know, to say just avoid foods that have those things is really hard to do, because there are so many pets with other sensitivities and issues and protein problems and allergies. So again, this is where naming brands becomes really tricky, and why I try to avoid that. Unfortunately, you kind of got to do your homework when it comes to what's right for your pet.
Okay. Moving a little bit away from brands and all of that. One question was, what should I do if I think my dog is affected, and how do I know?
So this becomes really difficult, because a lot of times there are no symptoms that really tell us that things are wrong. So this is why the annual or semi-annual, even better, veterinary appointments are really important. You know, it's important to make sure that you're getting in and making the time to have your vet look at your pet. Again, you know, any of the things that we're talking about, it's not meant to replace that advice, and it's not meant to replace, you know, your veterinarian's plan of care for your pet. So, you know, unfortunately, a lot of times we don't see issues until all of a sudden they either collapse, they have difficulty breathing, they have really fast breathing, they're tired, they're lethargic, they don't want to move. A lot of times there's reports of dogs not being hungry or wanting to eat. So all of those things could potentially be clues, but that's usually, unfortunately, really, really late signs. So, you know, again, knowing your pet and kind of any sort of odd behavior or lack of behavior or lack of interest in things could be clues to many different things, and that could definitely be one of them.
Next question was, where can I find more information?
So again, I really think that the FDA report is really good. I think that they put out a lot of really good and easily digestible information. I really would hesitate to look at a lot of like the news articles and things like that, because I think that they made some unfair summaries. So, and I don't think it's fair to have people kind of be freaking out and not know where to turn and not have enough information. So I really think the FDA is a good place to start. And if you go to that FDA report, in it, there's links to be able to actually look at a lot of the cases that they're looking at. I believe they posted all that they're talking about. So you can go in and see what food they were eating, and you can see some of their veterinary records. So that's a really good place to get some information. And then a lot of veterinarians have a lot of good information. There are still some, unfortunately, that don't know about the issue or don't know that it's as big of an issue because they're really busy. They have a lot to do. They're kind of the specialist, the general practitioner, the surgeon. They're everything. So if your vet doesn't know, or doesn't have enough information that you're looking for, there is also a veterinary cardiology page, and you can find that through the AVMA.
Awesome. Tied to that, how do I know if a source is legitimate?
So I thought I was really good at finding that stuff out until I got into my master's level work, and I realized I had no idea how to read a research study or look up information. So I think a good rule of thumb is if you're on a website or Facebook, that's probably not a great source of information. I think sometimes for like articles or people giving you, do this supplement, do things like that. I think, a lot of websites that are out there, they'll have opinion pieces by, some of these reporters and on the side, they're trying to sell a, their news article, or they're trying to sell, different, a little bit more skeptical of those types of things. I think, again, the FDA report is really sound information. I also think that some of you might like to go to Google Scholar and kind of look this up. There's a lot of information that they're starting to link between human health, human dilated cardiomyopathy, and diet issues back to pets and vice versa. And there are some really good articles or abstracts that are out there that that you might find interesting, or that might lead to some other information. And then to that point, if you're looking into some of those articles and you see them linking to certain universities, whether that's here or abroad, those are also sometimes really good sources. Sometimes you'll find research articles or theses by students that are on veterinary pages or university sites, and those are also a really good source of information.
Awesome. I'm just reading through the comments to make sure that we covered everything, because I just have one more question. What's that? Oops, am I lagging? Can you hear me?
I am. I don't know.
we're like two more. Let me just do this one question in the comments. So I was scrolling all the way to the very beginning. I just want to make sure that we got everybody. Let's see. It says, my dog is 10 months and is on prey model raw. This whole thing scares me that I'm not giving him enough grains, and since he's developing, I don't want to send him down a bad path. Do you want to talk a little bit about raw and where raw falls in all of this?
Yeah. So I think, again, mainstream opinion, I guess, is that raw is bad, and that there's a lot of risks that come with raw. And I think that that's a fair assessment. But to play devil's advocate, there's a lot of risks that come with kibble too. Obviously, we're having this Facebook Live, we're having this conversation. So kind of controlling your risks are paramount to that. We have HPP raws, we have fermented raws, we have fresh, organic, local raws. So I think it's safe to say that you can source something that is a high quality product, that's balanced, that's formulated correctly. So I think that if you choose raw correctly, I think it can be a really good option. If you look at the FDA report, there are very, very few cases of DCM on raw, and this assumption is that a lot of those are going to be, at least in part, genetic, right? So I I think, it's also important to understand that raw really shouldn't just be going to the grocery store and buying chicken breast and feeding that to your dog. That's really highly inappropriate, because the raw that is meant for pet consumption is processed very differently than that for humans. A lot of our chicken or our meat is full of salt, it's full of preservatives, it's full of different things that may be dangerous to our pets or may not be super helpful or healthful for that matter. I think that, it's important to understand that dogs need the bone, they need the organ, they need the different nutrients and amino acids that are in those things, or in the whole animal. And it's also important to understand that they really do need, at least in part, some of the vegetation, right? Not a whole lot of it, but there is some value to adding at least some leafy greens to the bowl. There was a study, I'm not sure if it's published, I did see it before it was published, and they took dogs that were eating raw, but they were eating no vegetation, right? So just protein and fat, whether that was the organs, the bone, the muscle meat. And then they measured samples of their microbiome. They did the same thing for kibble-fed dogs, and then they did the same thing for dogs that were fed raw with some vegetation. And they found that the dogs that were eating raw with vegetation had the most diverse microbiome and were healthier. Dogs that were having kibble were actually better off than the dogs that did not have any vegetation, which was really a really interesting finding. So the more diverse your microbiome is, the more resilient your body is going to be, or your pet's body is going to be, to different diseases and illness. And to that point, that's one of the things that they're kind of looking into with this DCM thing, because again, in humans, we have some cases where dysbiosis, or a lack of good balance of gut bacteria, has been linked to dilated cardiomyopathy. So it's fair to kind of research that theory in pets, considering that we feed them the same thing all the time, without much diversity and without much fresh or live food. So, again, it really depends. It depends on your animal. It depends what you're comfortable with, but it's just being smart about sourcing those types of things.
Yeah. Okay. We have been doing this for an hour. And I know I know there's like I know everybody has a ton of questions. And I hope this has been helpful. I'm just going to read through these comments again. I want to make sure that we get everybody. Let's see. There's one. Are you good with like one or two more questions?
Yeah.
I know how like being on the hot seat answering all this, it's a lot. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's see. Another question. Okay, so all the named pet food companies are putting out press releases and standing behind their products. Do you think they're just saving face, or do they have research behind their statements?
Some of them do, some of them don't, right? Like I said, we haven't carried most of them. We have some of them. And we haven't carried most of them for a long time. And I think there's other factors that go into it. We haven't carried some of them for heavy metal contamination. We haven't carried many of them for recall issues or just formulation issues. They don't have a nutritionist or veterinary nutritionist behind them. So I think those things are certainly really important. And I think they're things that pet owners need to take seriously. So some of them, their press releases are genuine. And I think from a research or an evidence-based standpoint, which is always what I try and speak to, at the end of the day, for each of those brands, it's really hard to make any scientific conclusions, right? It's really hard because we don't have enough data. Is there enough that we should be vigilant? Absolutely. Is it enough that we should go and condemn all of those brands? No. Could we condemn some of them? Sure. But again, a lot of that has to do with more than one reason, not just this particular reason.
Yeah. And that kind of also, I see a question from Taylor. It's kind of, we sort of covered this, or we did cover it earlier, but do you recommend changing if your food is one of the ones being researched further? And I think that all ties together, that it's not just questions DCM. Yeah. It's like looking into them in a bigger picture view, and seeing if they're the right choice for you. Is that
right? Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think any no matter what you pick, right, there's risks to it.
Right.
There's risks that, you can pick any dry food or any raw food and it can have pathogens, right?
Yeah.
There can be a misformulation. Look at Science Diet toward the beginning of the year. There was how many millions of canned dog food recalled due to excess vitamin D. Yeah. It's something as seemingly benign as vitamin D, can be a major issue. So again, it's putting things into perspective and reading your own individual pet. What's right for mine is not going to be right for yours or anybody else's. So just, doing best by your pet.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Last question. When will we have more answers?
I was kind of disappointed when this came out, because it really didn't say much more than we knew last year when they first kind of really started diving into this investigation. I believe last year they said it was going to be 5 years. I have not heard an update on that from them or seen one. Maybe somebody else has. There's been a lot of information I've been trying to comb through. But it's going to be several years. I wouldn't be surprised if it lasts longer than 5 years, only because their initial theory that this was taurine deficiency is kind of out the window. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, which is so frustrating.
It's so frustrating.
I mean, I think that was there was a lot to learn from the report, but I think that the frustrating takeaway is that it's an ongoing process and that it's something that we don't have definitive answers for.
Well, I think the good thing too is that, the fact that they kind of came out with a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah.
In regards to new information. They explained a lot of things really well. I think that kind of put this whole thing into context for a lot of people, but they're really doing their due diligence. And it's good that they're not kind of rushing to a conclusion that's not going to help us. I think at the end of the day, when they finally do reach their conclusion, I think we're going to have a lot more information about the nutrition of pets and how different things are metabolized and more importantly, what happens to food when we cook it to that unrecognizable state, right? I think a lot of people don't realize, they're kind of surprised to learn that a lot of, not all of it, but a lot of what we use to formulate pet food is over 50 years old. Not all of it, I don't want that to be taken out of context by any stretch, but a lot of what is used and what, AFCO kind of goes by and sets their guidelines by is really old.
Yeah. Wow. Well, if that's not a way to end a Facebook Live, I don't know what is. Oh my gosh. I can't thank you enough
thanks for having me.
Taking the time I feel like I learned so much, and I hope for everybody that stuck with us for more than an hour that this was helpful for everybody, and that everybody, at least I feel like I can breathe a little bit lighter, just knowing that there's people like you in this world that are advocating for our pets, and that you're such a wealth of information that thank you.
No, well, thanks for having me. And I'm kind of sorry because I know some people are probably disappointed because, you want brands and you want more concrete information. And I think, it would be really irresponsible of me or you or anybody really to kind of say, hey, listen, here are the answers. It's going to be a long time before we have that. So, again, just putting things into context of, read your pet, look and see how they do, how they respond, how they're feeling, how they're looking on their food. If things aren't right, please consult your veterinarian.
Yep. Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicci. Thanks everybody for joining. Hope it was helpful, and talk to everybody soon.
Take care. Bye
guys.